Two elderly passengers, side by side, waiting quietly in the seats they'd chosen, the seats they'd paid for, as though nothing in the world could disturb their calm. And yet, within half a minute of one phone call, the entire atmosphere on that aircraft shifted. It started with a flight attendant leaning in, her voice just low enough to make the words sound like an instruction rather than a request. A second crew member joined, then a supervisor. The tone changed. The smiles were gone. Passengers around them began to turn their heads, sensing something was off. You could feel it. The unease, the tension, the way authority seemed to falter in real time. Crew members who moments earlier seemed so certain now avoided eye contact. A manager appeared at the front of the cabin, scanning the rows like they were searching for an escape route rather than a resolution. And I was right there, 2 rows behind, watching the exact moment the balance shifted, when a quiet refusal to move triggered a chain of events that would reach the very top of the airline's leadership. But that part, you'll need to see for yourself. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss these true human stories. And drop a comment telling me the country you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're joining us from, because trust me, this one, you'll want to hear every word. They boarded like any other passengers, slowly, deliberately, the way people who've learned not to rush through life tend to move. The man's posture was straight despite his years, his silver hair cropped neatly, a newspaper tucked under his arm. Beside him, the woman wore a light scarf patterned with small blue flowers, the ends fluttering gently as she walked. They didn't look like people seeking attention. In fact, their whole presence gave off a quiet dignity that drew it without them trying. Their names were Henry and Loretta James, 52 years married. He was once a professor of American history, known for a voice that could make the driest facts feel alive. She had spent 4 decades as a nurse, the kind of nurse patients still wrote to years after leaving the hospital, just to say thank you. Together, they had raised 3 children, each of whom had gone on to build their own lives. One in law, one in education, one in engineering. This trip wasn't business, it was family. The Jameses were heading to Seattle for their granddaughter's graduation, a milestone Henry had insisted on seeing in person. Their son Ethan had booked them first-class tickets as a gift. It was meant to be comfortable, easy, a small luxury they'd earned 100 times over. Henry was a meticulous traveler, printed boarding passes, checked luggage tags, confirmation emails saved and highlighted. Loretta preferred to keep her attention on people, not paperwork, smiling at the gate agent, asking after the attendant's day, complimenting another passenger's dress. From the start, nothing about their boarding felt unusual. They moved through the jet bridge, found their seats in the second row of first class, stored their carry-ons. Henry settled in with his crossword. Loretta took out a paperback. The hum of boarding carried on, the shuffle of passengers, the overhead bins opening and closing, the low murmur of greetings. Then, somewhere behind them, a late boarding couple entered the cabin. The man glanced at their seats, then at his own ticket. His partner frowned. Within moments, a uniformed attendant approached Henry and Loretta, a practiced smile in place but an edge in her tone. "Sir, ma'am, you're in the wrong seats," she said. Henry looked up, puzzled. "No, we're in 2A and 2B, he replied, handing her the printed passes. She glanced at them briefly, then said, "These passengers are assigned here. I'll need you to move to other seats so we can get everyone settled." The other seats, she meant, weren't in first class. And from the way her eyes slid past them to the couple waiting, it was clear this wasn't about a mix-up in the system. Henry's hand stayed steady as he held the passes out again. Loretta's smile had faded. The boarding chatter around them began to thin, replaced by a quieter, heavier pause. No one knew it yet, but this was the moment where a family trip would turn into something else entirely. The attendant didn't budge. She kept one hand on the headrest in front of Henry, leaning slightly forward, as if proximity alone might persuade them to stand. "Sir, these passengers have the same seats on their boarding passes. I'm asking you to relocate so we can get this flight underway." Henry's brows lifted slightly, his voice calm. "And I'm showing you the boarding passes your airline issued us. First class, row 2, seats A and B. We've paid for them, and we'd like to remain here." The woman's expression stiffened. She glanced toward the aisle where the white couple stood. The man's arms folded, the woman's mouth set in a tight line. They weren't speaking, but their body language said plenty. They weren't considering switching to economy. Passengers in nearby rows began to take notice. The man across from Henry lowered his phone, listening. Two women a few rows back leaned forward to see. It wasn't loud, but the tension was undeniable. The attendant tried again, this time with a clipped tone that was harder to disguise as polite. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to involve a supervisor. I'm trying to avoid making this into a bigger issue. Loretta turned her head toward Henry, her voice barely above a whisper. Bigger issue for who? Within minutes, a male supervisor in a different uniform stepped into the aisle. His badge read Lead Flight Service Manager. He smiled at the couple waiting, then crouched slightly to address Henry and Loretta. Sir, ma'am, he began. We're experiencing a bit of a seating conflict. If you wouldn't mind moving, we can offer you seats in our premium economy cabin, plus a complimentary meal and a travel voucher. The offer sounded rehearsed, the kind given often enough to come with practiced phrasing. But Henry wasn't a man who measured fairness in free meals. That's kind, he said. But no, these are our seats. We'll be staying in them. The supervisor straightened, the smile thinning. We're trying to resolve this amicably. The other passengers also have tickets for these seats. Perhaps there's been a glitch, but right now I need you to move. Naomi, 2 rows back, could see Loretta's knuckles tighten around the edge of her paperback. She'd stopped reading long ago, but she wasn't shrinking into her seat. Henry didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. We've shown you our boarding passes. You've verified them. We're not moving. If there's a glitch, fix it without asking us to give up what we paid for. Something passed across the supervisor's face then. Irritation, maybe frustration, but more than that, the faint recognition that this wasn't going to go the way he'd planned. He stepped into the galley to speak with the attendant in low tones. A few moments later, the attendant returned, her eyes cooler now. Sir, ma'am, please understand we have procedures. Henry cut in, still measured. Procedures that involve removing paying passengers from their assigned seats to make room for others? The words hung there. Some passengers looked down, others looked away. But no one in the surrounding rows could ignore the fact that every visible boarding pass in this dispute matched the Jameses. Yet the pressure was only flowing in one direction. The couple waiting shifted impatiently, whispering to each other. Loretta caught the glance the woman shot her, a brief, assessing look that carried its own quiet insult. Henry adjusted his glasses. If you have further instructions, you can tell them to my attorney. The attendant hesitated. Sir, that's not necessary. Henry reached into his blazer pocket, drew out his phone, and began scrolling to his contacts. Then I'll make it so. By now, the energy in the cabin had shifted. This wasn't a routine seating mix-up. This was something else, something that made crew members stiffen and passengers hold their breath. Henry tapped a name on his screen and lifted the phone to his ear. He didn't glance at the supervisor, didn't address the waiting couple. He simply said into the receiver, Ethan, we have a problem on our flight. No one in that cabin knew exactly what would follow. Not the crew, not the passengers, not even the 2 people sitting in those disputed seats. But in less than 30 seconds, the hierarchy on that plane was about to change. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss these true, human stories. And drop a comment telling me the country you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're joining us from. The call wasn't loud. Henry didn't need volume to make his point. His tone carried all the weight it needed. Ethan, we have a problem on our flight, he said, each word deliberate. There was a pause, the faint sound of a voice on the other end. Yes, first class. Row 2. We're being asked to give up our seats. No explanation that makes sense. Another pause. We'll wait. He ended the call without another word, set the phone on the armrest, and opened his crossword book again as though nothing had happened. The supervisor stood nearby, hands clasped, trying to mask his uncertainty. The attendant shifted from one foot to the other. In the aisle, the white couple remained frozen in place, still clutching their boarding passes, their impatience starting to show. Then it happened. Less than half a minute later, The supervisor's radio crackled. He answered with a clipped yes and listened. His posture changed almost instantly, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowing as he glanced at the Jameses. He murmured something into the radio, nodding rapidly. A gate agent appeared from the jet bridge, slipping into the cabin with the kind of cautious urgency usually reserved for medical situations. She bent close to the supervisor, speaking in a low voice. Whatever she said made him blink twice and straighten his uniform. Passengers in the surrounding rows began exchanging looks. They didn't know what was being said, but they could sense it. The shift in authority, the way the crew's confidence was suddenly tempered with hesitation. The gate agent approached Henry and Loretta, her voice quieter and her expression almost deferential. "Mr. and Mrs. James, I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. There's been a misunderstanding. You're welcome to remain in your assigned seats." Henry didn't look up from his crossword. "We plan to." The agent swallowed, offered a strained smile, and retreated toward the front of the cabin. The supervisor followed, speaking quickly into his radio again. The flight attendant who'd started the exchange now avoided making eye contact altogether, busily checking overhead bins that were already shut. The white couple was quietly escorted out of the cabin and down the aisle. They didn't protest, but the man's jaw was tight and the woman kept her gaze fixed ahead. No explanation was offered to them within earshot, but the murmurs from nearby passengers followed them all the way to the back. Loretta closed her book gently, resting it on her lap. She didn't say a word to Henry, but her hand found his, squeezing once, not in fear, but in affirmation. From 2 rows back, you could see what the rest of the plane was only just starting to grasp. Whatever had happened on that phone call had gone far beyond this cabin. Someone, somewhere, had made it very clear that removing this couple from their seats was no longer an option. And for the crew members still exchanging uneasy glances at the front of the plane, it was becoming equally clear that this misunderstanding might not stay contained to the aircraft for long. The plane was still at the gate, but the air inside felt different now. Less like the orderly hum of boarding and more like everyone was holding back questions they didn't dare ask out loud. The supervisor kept glancing toward the front, listening to his radio. His earlier confidence had faded into something almost cautious, as though every move now had to be weighed against an invisible clock counting down. The flight attendant who'd initiated the confrontation busied herself with a drinks cart that didn't need rearranging. From 2 rows back, it was obvious the incident wasn't over. Whatever authority had pulled the brake on their actions was still in motion somewhere beyond the cabin walls. Within minutes, a new figure appeared at the aircraft door. A man in a tailored suit with an airport operations badge clipped to his pocket. He didn't greet the crew. He didn't smile. He walked straight to the James's row, leaning in slightly without blocking the aisle. "Mr. and Mrs. James," he said, voice low but clear, "I'd like to extend our apologies on behalf of the airline. This never should have happened." Henry closed his crossword, resting it neatly on the tray table. "Yet it did." The man didn't flinch. "I understand. We're committed to making it right." Loretta tilted her head. "Making it right would have been letting us sit here without interruption in the first place." A pause. The man nodded once. "You're correct." Passengers nearby listened without pretending otherwise. Some of them exchanged glances, the kind that acknowledged the unspoken truth hanging in the air. They all knew why this couple, and not others, had been targeted. The only people pretending otherwise were the ones who'd started it. As the suited man returned to the front of the cabin, Naomi noticed another small but telling detail. The white couple, who had been waiting for the seats, were no longer in sight. They hadn't been reseated in first class. The gate agent had walked them out of the cabin entirely, and if they were still on the plane, they were sitting somewhere far behind. The engines rumbled faintly as boarding wrapped up. The announcements came in a tone so neutral, it almost sounded like an apology. Even the safety demonstration felt brisk, stripped of the usual performative cheer. But the story didn't stay confined to the plane. By the time the seatbelt sign turned off after takeoff, several passengers had already typed out detailed accounts of what they'd seen, some attaching photos of the Jameses calmly seated with their boarding passes in hand, while crew members leaned over them. One passenger posted to social media mid-flight, the caption blunt, "First-class black couple told to move to economy so a white couple could sit down. They refused." One phone call later, crew backed off. Wonder why? Within hours, the post had thousands of shares. Comments poured in, from outrage to recognition. People told their own stories of being accidentally seated away from what they'd paid for, of being pressured into downgrades that mysteriously only seemed to happen to certain passengers. In the back of the plane, one of the flight attendants scrolled through her phone on break, frowning at the growing online chatter. She kept glancing toward the front, as though trying to gauge just how far this would spread before the flight even landed. Henry didn't check his phone. Loretta didn't either. They spoke quietly to each other, occasionally laughing at some private remark. They didn't look like people basking in a victory. They looked like people who had simply insisted on being treated the way they should have been all along. 2 hours into the flight, a handwritten note arrived from the purser. "If there's anything we can do to make your journey more comfortable, please let us know." It was signed with a name and a phone extension, a gesture that was less about service and more about protection, as if the crew now feared any further misstep could escalate into something catastrophic for their careers. As the plane descended into Seattle, passengers craned to see if anything else would happen. The Jameses stood when it was their row's turn to deplane. Henry retrieving their bags, Loretta adjusting her scarf. Crew members offered polite farewells, but none of them made eye contact for more than a second. At the gate, another suited airline representative was waiting. No cameras, no crowd, just a quiet exchange of business cards, a few earnest words, and a visible effort to project control over a situation that was slipping beyond their grasp. Because the truth was already moving faster than any corporate statement they could draft. The calls that mattered had already been made, and the people at the very top of the airline's leadership were about to learn just how costly this misunderstanding was going to be. By the time the Jameses had stepped off the jet bridge, the situation had already traveled far beyond the terminal. The call Henry had placed to his son wasn't just a plea for help. It had been a direct line to one of the most influential legal figures in the aviation industry. Ethan James wasn't just an attorney. He was the general counsel for the airline's parent company, the holding group that owned and managed multiple carriers under one corporate umbrella. For years, Ethan had kept his professional and personal life separate. But this was different. This wasn't a stranger. This was his mother and father. The same people who had sacrificed for his education, who had spent decades living with the quiet resilience of being black in America, and who had been humiliated in a cabin they paid to sit in. The CEO of the airline had been in a meeting on the 27th floor of the company's headquarters when his assistant stepped in, pale and urgent, to say, "You're going to want to take this call." Within minutes, executives were scrambling. Risk assessment teams, PR heads, and legal advisors all looped in at once. The potential damage wasn't just reputational. The airline was days away from finalizing a multi-billion-dollar joint venture with a West African carrier. That deal hinged on maintaining a strong public image and avoiding even the appearance of racial discrimination. An incident involving elderly black passengers being asked to give up paid first-class seats for white travelers? That wasn't a PR headache. That was a corporate nightmare. Ethan didn't raise his voice when he spoke to the CEO. He didn't need to. His words were direct. "You're about to see photos and passenger accounts online. This is my family. Handle it immediately, or the merger talks end now." Within the hour, department heads were calling down to the Seattle gate. Local operations managers were ordered to ensure the Jameses were met upon arrival. Flight staff were instructed to cease all discussion of the incident outside of formal reports. But the damage control strategy had a flaw. Passengers had already posted what they saw. In a conference room, the airline's PR director clicked through screenshots of social media posts. "We can't contain this," she admitted. Not without making it worse. The CEO pinched the bridge of his nose, knowing exactly what that meant. The story would break whether they spoke or not. Meanwhile, in the terminal, Henry and Loretta weren't asking for special treatment. They collected their luggage, exchanged polite words with the representative who met them at the gate, and went on their way. But the quietness of their departure only seemed to underscore the absurdity of the situation. Because while they walked toward the airport exit, the higher floors of corporate headquarters were in full damage control mode. Phone lines lit up, legal drafts being rewritten, and nervous executives rethinking whether a certain flight crew would still have jobs by the end of the week. The Jameses didn't see the chaos they had set in motion, but it was happening, and the ripple effect was only just beginning. As we continue, make sure you're subscribed to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss these true human stories. And drop a comment telling me the country you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're joining us from. The flight had ended hours ago, but the conversation it sparked was only gaining momentum. By that evening, the photos and first-hand accounts from passengers had spread across social media, racking up thousands of shares and comments. Hashtags calling out airline discrimination began trending. News blogs picked it up first, then larger media outlets followed. The central detail people kept repeating wasn't just what happened, it was who it happened to. Henry and Loretta were not anonymous travelers. They were an elderly black couple with impeccable travel documentation, seated in the correct section they had paid for, and yet still told to move for white passengers. The fact that they had powerful family connections only brought the truth into sharper focus. If this could happen to them, what chance did the average black traveler have when faced with similar treatment? Stories began pouring into comment sections. A black family told to check in late, only to find their seats reassigned to others. A young black woman randomly downgraded to coach after boarding, frequent flyers noticing they were the ones asked to accommodate. Others more often than not. The statistics backed it up. Advocacy groups cited Department of Transportation complaints showing a disproportionate number of service disputes and downgrades affecting passengers of color. Former airline employees came forward anonymously, saying these mistakes weren't always accidents. Sometimes they were rooted in assumptions about who belonged where. And yet, for every public story, there were countless others that never made it past the gate. Moments swallowed in silence because the person involved didn't have a platform, didn't have proof, or didn't believe anyone would care. That was the part Henry and Loretta couldn't let go of when they spoke to Ethan later that night. They knew their outcome. Keeping their seats, receiving a formal apology, was not typical. For many others, the fight would have ended differently. Mom, Dad? Ethan had told them over the phone, "This isn't just about you. This is about making sure it doesn't happen to someone who can't pick up the phone and reach a CEO." And he was right. Even from the comfort of their home that evening, Henry replayed the way the attendant had looked at them, the casual assumption in her voice that they would quietly accept the downgrade. Loretta remembered the quick glance the white woman gave her, not hostile, but dismissive, like someone rearranging furniture. In interviews and discussions that followed in the coming weeks, advocacy leaders stressed a simple but powerful point. Racism in customer service often hides in policy language. Words like accommodate, reassign, and upgrade were used to soften the reality that decisions about where people sat, how they were treated, and whether they belonged often came down to biases no ticketing system could excuse. The bigger picture was impossible to ignore. The airline's merger talks were quietly paused. Behind closed doors, executives reviewed not just this incident, but a decade's worth of discrimination complaints, fearing what might surface if regulators took a closer look. For Henry and Loretta, the experience became a stark reminder that status, money, and credentials don't always protect you from prejudice. Their son's influence had altered the ending, but the opening act, the humiliation, the public questioning of their right to be there, was the part no phone call could erase. This wasn't a one-off. It was part of a pattern, and patterns can only be broken if they're dragged into the light. And as the online conversation grew, it was becoming clear that this light wasn't going out anytime soon. The incident could have ended at the airport. They could have gone to the reunion, smiled for photos, and let the entire experience fade into something only the passengers on that flight remembered. But the elderly black couple had lived long enough to know that silence rarely leads to change. When Ethan visited them the next morning, he brought more than just his concern as a son. He carried the full weight of his legal authority and industry influence. Over coffee at their kitchen table, they talked openly about what had happened, and more importantly, how many others had likely experienced the same treatment without the means to challenge it. "I've got meetings with the board this week," Ethan said. "If you're willing, I want your account of exactly what happened. Not just for them, for the record." They agreed. Not for vengeance, but because their dignity had been challenged in a way that spoke to something much larger than just one flight. They wanted to make sure no other passenger would face the same pressure, especially those without a direct line to someone in corporate leadership. Over the following days, Ethan pushed the incident into the spotlight inside the company. It wasn't framed as a customer service misunderstanding. It was labeled for what it was: discriminatory treatment. He called for mandatory anti-bias training across all the airline's brands, stronger oversight of in-flight seating disputes, and a requirement that any downgrade requests be logged and reviewed by legal compliance before action was taken. Meanwhile, the couple agreed to share their story with advocacy groups focused on racial equality in travel. They didn't embellish. They didn't dramatize. They simply described the facts and let those facts speak for themselves. Their story began appearing in articles, community forums, and podcasts, often paired with statistics that painted an undeniable picture of systemic issues in the airline industry. Letters started arriving at their home, handwritten notes from strangers across the country. Some came from fellow retirees who'd faced the same treatment but hadn't known how to push back. Others came from young travelers, thanking them for standing their ground. One letter from a college student read, "You didn't just stay in your seats. You stayed in your place as equals, and you showed the rest of us that we can too." At the family reunion in Seattle, their arrival was met with applause. Relatives had followed the coverage and couldn't hide their pride. But Henry and Loretta downplayed it, reminding everyone that the real goal was not praise. It was progress. In private, they admitted they felt a mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing their refusal had forced the airline to act. But there was also a quiet sadness in realizing that, at their age, they were still fighting battles they'd hoped would have been won decades earlier. Still, they believed that every small victory mattered. And this one, they hoped, would ripple far beyond one flight, one crew, or one pair of seats in first class. Because sometimes the greatest act of resistance isn't loud. It's simply staying where you belong and refusing to be moved. Weeks later, the noise surrounding the incident hadn't died down. The airline eventually issued a formal statement. Not the vague kind that dodges accountability, but one that named the problem and pledged change. Ethan had made sure of it. New internal policies were announced, including mandatory anti-discrimination protocols for seating disputes and a zero-tolerance policy for targeted downgrades. For the elderly black couple, it wasn't about winning against an airline. It was about making sure that what happened to them was harder to repeat in silence. They had seen too many moments in life where unfair treatment went unchecked, simply because the people involved didn't have the power to challenge it. This time, they had that power, and they used it. Looking back, the most striking part wasn't the phone call or the corporate scramble it triggered. It was the quiet certainty with which they stayed in their seats. No raised voices, no threats, just an unshakable refusal to accept less than what they had paid for and deserved. At their next church gathering, a friend approached Loretta and said, "You didn't just sit in those seats for you. You sat in them for all of us." It stayed with her. Because in her mind, the real victory wasn't the apology, the policy change, or even the headlines. It was the idea that someone, somewhere, might remember their story the next time they were told to move when they shouldn't have to. Their lives returned to routine, but the ripple effects of that day lingered. In quiet ways, a thank you note from a stranger, a message from a flight attendant who said she'd changed how she handled disputes, an email from an advocacy group sharing how many complaints they'd received since the story went public. Racism in travel wasn't solved by one incident, and they knew it. But it had been challenged, openly, publicly, and without apology. If you're watching this, remember, staying silent protects no one. If you see something wrong, speak up. If you experience discrimination, tell your story. And if you have the chance to stand your ground, even if it's just a seat on a plane, take it. Thank you for watching Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. If this story moved you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let us know in the comments the country you're watching from. Your voice matters, and your presence here keeps these conversations alive. Because dignity is not a privilege, it's a right, and no one should have to fight for the seat they've already earned.